we'll be talking today about menopause and the brain. And we decided to do this because after Davina McCall did that amazing documentary, there were lots of people with lots of questions. We wrote a piece for the conversation, if you're interested in that, with Emma O'Donnell and Rebecca Hardy, who is speaking next week, and Emma who spoke the week before, to try to clarify this really difficult literature and to try to get a better view on why there is so much confusion, in particular about the menopause and the brain. So if you have issues while going through menopause, you're not alone. So the vast majority of women going through this phase report hot flushes. That can affect their sleep. Also because they have night sweats, they can wake up with wet sheets. That, of course, affects their work. People complain about brain fog, issues with concentration, mood, irritability to colleagues, and urogenital issues. So vaginal dryness, lack of libido, having to urinate frequently. And for about 1 in 10 women, this is so severe, they end up quitting their job. And about 1 in 5 has measurable memory problems. So going through the menopause affects a lot of women, but the extent is to which effect that is. Can you actually measure that effect? And what can we do about it? So we'll be talking about that in the next couple of minutes. So as Emma said last week, what is the menopause? In case you didn't have a chance to see that amazing lecture, it's recorded. This is just a slide to kind of show you what happens. So we have these eggs here in the ovaries, and they become dysfunctional, and they normally help to regulate our cycle, and they are associated with periods and fertility and what have you. But as these eggs become less functional and die off, our hormones start fluctuating. They're all over the place. And they will go down, but sometimes still go up. And that transition period, which we call the perimenopause, so this is before the actual periods stop, is when most of the issues seem to occur with regards to brain function, the brain fog, the irritability, the mood issues, the libido. So what about terminology? Well, if you haven't had your period for over a year, you are now post-menopausal. And this normally occurs around the age of 50, 51. But that can go either way. That can go 7 years. So in some women that occurs earlier, and other women that occurs later. If it occurs before the age of 45, we talk about early menopause. If it occurs before the age of 40, we talk about premature menopause. And that usually happens when either the ovaries are taken out, so we can't produce hormones, or people are given chemicals, for instance, for breast cancer, to stop the production of these hormones. And what then happens is that we get acute and really severe symptoms. So here again, a picture of what happens over the natural menopause. It's gradual in the years before the menopause. So you might not even be aware of this. Your periods might be irregular. You might be bleeding more or bleeding less, but you might not be aware that these changes can drive massive changes in how you feel about yourself and others. But in surgical menopause, what happens is that that drop is really acute. And that has effects because estrogens can affect pretty much any function, any physiological system that is associated with brain aging. Emma told you last week that estrogens are protective for the heart and they create a better internal environment for your heart to function optimally. And the brain, of course, depends on oxygen and glucose and a good blood flow. So if estrogens go down, that effect, the lack of that beneficial effect on heart function can also be seen in having an effect on the brain. But estrogens do so much more. So they stimulate the blood flow in the brain and the uptake of glucose, but they also stimulate the branching of these nerve endings. So neurons, brain cells, can communicate better with each other. They can protect against all sorts of damage that's done to the brain as we age. And when we're younger, we have a lot of protective biological mechanisms, but as we age, that ceases and more of the brain is under attack. But estrogens can help maintain a healthy brain. Estrogens can also act on the chemicals that are released between neurons and that help communication between neurons. And that can explain some of the effects perhaps on the mood, because these chemicals, they would normally be affected by pharmaceutical medications such as antidepressants, and estrogens can have very similar effects. Now, what happens after surgical menopause? So if we take the ovaries out, if we do that before the natural age of menopause, we can see a huge dive in verbal memory performance and also a little bit of a decrease in attention and an increase in slowing of information processing. So we can see that there is a huge dive, and several studies have shown this to occur. If we take estrogens, we can reverse that effect from happening. If we then take a placebo, we get worse again. And then if we take the hormones again, we get better again. We go back to the level we were at before the surgical menopause occurred. And there have been other studies showing that women who have undergone that surgery, also known as ovarectomy, have a higher risk. So this is a higher risk of cognitive impairment. If that occurs before the natural age of menopause at around 50 years of age, and we can see even if we take out one ovary before the age of 40, the risk is doubled. Now, if we take out another ovary, if we take out an ovary before the age of 34, the risk for later life impairment is 4 times. So there's been a study by Walter Rocca showing that if these women are not given hormones, so this is, with this line here, there's no effect. This being on this side of the line means you're protected. Being on that side of the line means you're at increased risk. And so what Walter Rocca found in his data was that women who were given hormones, who had undergone surgical menopause, and who were given hormones up to the natural age of menopause, who were not given these hormones, had a double risk for later life dementia. If they were given hormones, that risk was not increased. And if only the womb was taken out, but not the ovaries, they were still at a reduced risk for dementia as compared to women who had the ovaries taken out. Now, what happens in natural menopause? So the majority of women will undergo a natural menopause where the ovaries become less functional, and then we see these changes. And here at time 0, this is the last menopause, the last period. And so this is the years after the menopause. And this is before. And what we see before menopause is that women who are overweight have slightly lower verbal memory functions. But over time, these women show to improve on these tests a little bit. And that is because when we do a task repeatedly, we learn how to do the test. But what was interesting, and this has been shown now in several studies, is that whilst before the menopause, these normal weight women, these healthy women, perform better at these verbal memory tasks, which are very sensitive to later life dementia, after the menopause, they don't do quite as well. And the question is, so this is hypothetical, we don't know if this happens, but here what we see is a dip. So in that study, they said, well, this might happen, so these women might actually be at an increased risk. And they said that is because, in fact, women can form estrogens, okay? So fat women would be protected against memory impairment. Now, if we look at other studies following women over time, the same women over time, such as that study, we see that, but these effects are temporal. So they don't last. So the negative effects we see in that transition period is temporary. And that might be related to some studies also showing a little bit of an effect on attention and the slowing of information processing. Again, that is temporary. And how do we know that it's temporary? Well, if we compare groups of women before the menopause versus women who are long past the menopause, we see no difference in verbal memory, or the other tasks for that matter. There's one study here that did, and I want to show you what the difference was with that study. So in this study by Polimaki's group with Dr. Weber, what they found was that women in the first year of menopause suddenly were a lot worse than before, in these different phases before. So in that first year of transition, they were a lot worse in verbal learning, verbal memory, the speed and attention needed to do the tasks. But when Weber followed these women over time, what they found was that this was transitory. And in fact, the vast majority did not change in their cognitive performance at all, had no differences in that menopausal transition, and some even reported better memory and better attention. But about 1 in 4, 1 in 5 women had much worse measurable memory deficits. So, and in these women, that was related to worse sleep. So if you're talking to your friends and people say, oh, I'm not bothered at all. Yeah, that could well be. And some women might even say, well, I think I'm actually doing better. And some women might well be. But 1 in 4 women have measurable worse memory. So if these women say, I've got brain fog, I can't concentrate, I can't recall the name of my best friend, that might well actually be measurable. So the conclusion of this is that there are no large differences in brain function when we compare women before and after natural menopause. We did see that huge effect after surgical menopause, but not natural menopause. But in the transition, so when these hormones are fluctuating and the first year of the menopause, we do see temporary problems in memory and learning with some attention and slowing, which is measurable, which can actually be measured in 1 out of 4 women. And that might be related to poor sleep. So that is that. But what about dementia? So a lot of people say, yeah, but what about dementia? Because I don't know if you saw Davina McCall's documentary, but it was suggested that unless you took hormones for the menopause, you would be at a much increased risk. So what's the actual evidence? Where are they coming from? Well, where they're coming from is the following. So dementia is a brain disorder. It's not a natural consequence of aging. It's an actual disease in the brain. So we're forming plaques, tangles, we've got vascular effects, we've got lack of oxygen. We can see that in various types of pathologies and diseases of the brain. And what we see is there is a gradual decline in functioning in the most common type of dementia called Alzheimer's disease. And that is very slow and gradual. And then there are other types of dementia like vascular dementia and Lewy bodies disease, frontotemporal dementia. But in the vast majority of cases of dementia, it will be Alzheimer's disease. And with the same test being affected of verbal memory, you could see that a lot of women are worried. I was standing next to my best friend and I didn't know her name. And I said, I've known you for 25 years. I have to introduce you. I'm sorry, your name currently eludes me. That is shocking stuff. That is not a good look. So these issues with verbal memory scare a lot of women, and they're thinking, my God, maybe I'm having this slow and gradual decline in memory function. Maybe I am being set up to have dementia. And there is biological plausibility for this. As I showed you, estrogens can protect the aging brain in oh so many ways against dementia and memory loss. And in fact, it has been said that the biological plausibility for estrogens to protect against dementia is its strongest suit. So many animal studies, so many cell culture studies have shown that estrogens can protect the brain. And we know after menopause, women have lower levels of estrogens, in particular estradiol. So I'm sorry about this here. So in England, we write estrogens with an O, but in America, we write it with an E. So we're losing that estradiol. And women have the higher risk of dementia. They have a higher risk of dementia. So could this all be related to one another? Well, I want to show you that. So this is data from Oxford, where we had here the men, and these are older women, and they have so much lower levels of estradiol compared to the men, except when they take hormone replacement therapy, then the levels are much higher. So maybe we could add back estrogens. And this is testosterone. Now, again, older men have much higher levels than women, and you might think, so what? But testosterone can be converted into estradiol in fat tissue. And I just showed you that slide that suggested that fat women might be protected for memory decline. Now, this is data showing dementia prevalence. And again, here in blue, you can see that that increase in dementia risk, very much similar to the increase in cardiovascular disease risk Emma reported, is much higher in women, particularly over the age of 80. And here you can see that, so this is per age group, is that difference isn't particularly large before the age of 85, but after the age of 85, women have a much higher risk of Alzheimer's disease. But that might well be because men tend to die earlier. I don't know if you remember from Emma's slide last week, but men tend to die much earlier of heart disease than women. So they die before they can develop dementia. And this is important because the risk factors for heart disease, such as central obesity, having a high blood pressure, high cholesterol, diabetes in midlife, are also risk factors for dementia. Smoking, having a poor diet, not exercising, not sleeping, the risk factors for heart disease, they're modifiable. You can do something about it, but they're also risk factors for dementia. So what's bad for the heart is bad for the brain. But this changes over the lifetime. And this is what's so confusing. So here in midlife, which is about 15 to 20 years for most people before the onset of dementia, we see high blood pressures. We see more being a risk factor for later onset of dementia. We see obesity being a risk factor for later onset of dementia. We see high cholesterol being a risk factor for onset of dementia. But a couple of years before the onset of dementia, many studies have shown that for some reason, and we're not sure why, blood pressure starts going down. Weight starts dropping, cholesterol starts dropping. And when we measure people with dementia versus those without, we actually see lower blood pressures, lower cholesterol, and lower body mass once people have dementia. And that might be related to a wasting disease. A lot of people who are sick, also, for instance, people who've had heart disease, will show a wasting syndrome. Now, that might be because people stop exercising, and so people will start losing muscle mass hand over. The question is, what role can hormones play in this? Could hormones perhaps in midlife? Because Emma showed you last week, they can definitely favorably affect all these factors like blood pressure, like cholesterol, like weight. So it depends a little bit on what we give and how we give it. The transdermal patch doesn't have these negative effects on blood clotting, for instance, which is a risk. But in the past, estrogens and progestrogens were often given in a pill. Recently, they've manufactured estrogel, which you can apply on your thigh or your upper arms, and then you can regulate the amount a little bit better yourself. So what is it? Estrogens is normally given either as estradiol, which is the natural estrogen in your body, or a synthetic estrogen. Here, for instance, very popular in the US, the conjugated equine estrogens made of pregnant mare urine, also known as CEE. If we have a womb, we need to take progesterone, because otherwise we get cancer of the womb. So women who have undergone surgery and had their ovaries and womb taken out can just take an estrogen. But for those women undergoing natural menopause, you need to take a progesterone. So when I started looking at this, estrogens and HRT were considered to be the elixir of life. You could stop the aging clock. Many women were so enthusiastic about it. And as a consequence, huge trials were set up. And the same people who initially were very enthusiastic about the possibilities of HRT then said, actually, it doesn't work at all. It doesn't do anything on the brain. And in fact, if anything, it might make it worse. And Professor David Purdy, I heard him on the radio, said this. And it very much reflected the sense of the time. And as a result, many GPs stopped prescribing HRT, and it's still very difficult to get HRT. So what had happened? Well, all these observational studies previously showed that if estrogens were taken before the age of 60, 65, close to the age of menopause, the risk for dementia was about halved. But then this happened. All of a sudden, two studies came out. One arm had estrogen only for women who didn't have a womb. There was no difference there. But for women who took the combination therapy, that conjugated equine estrogen, the synthetic progesterone, the risk for dementia was doubled. And it was a shockwave. Nobody had seen this coming. I was called in to talk with an expert group about this effect. And we sat there, we were stunned, because I just showed you all that biological plausibility, and they should have worked, but they didn't. So what was going on? Well, for starters, and Emma alluded to this last week in the Women's Health Initiative study, the treatment was given to women for this particular aspect of the study, and women who were over 65 years of age, and those women if they took estrogen and progesterone, so on average 15 years after the menopause, they had a higher risk of dementia. So what was going on? Because we had all these observational studies here showing a halved risk. How could that be? Now, in those observational studies, and this is what we call a bias, so this is something that kind of comes in and might explain why we see that difference between this treatment study showing an increased risk for dementia, an increased risk for heart disease, which we really hadn't expected, versus previously all these studies where they asked women, did you take hormones for the menopause or did you not? And when we compared this to the actual records from pharmacists, it turned out that about 20% of women with Alzheimer's disease, AD here, Alzheimer's disease, could not remember they'd taken HRT. Surprisingly, 10% of women who did not have Alzheimer's disease could also not recall it. But that could explain that doubled effect, so that halved reduction of risk. So what we then need to do, you say, is look at pharmacologist records. And this was done. So a huge study was done in the UK led by Professor Tom Denning. And what they found was that women who took estrogens only, so these are the women who would have had their wombs removed, taken out, who would have undergone the surgical menopause, there was indeed a small protective effect, certainly when taken up to 3 to 5 years. But the women who took estrogen and progesterone for more than 10 years, and that effect already started after 5 years, had an increased risk for dementia. So overall, there's no effect. But in these women who took the combined treatment, there was a risk for dementia. So now this is women who would have started perhaps in their 50s, natural menopause, and it would have taken it for 10 years. And now the risk is increased by 20%. So that's quite a bit. Now, what about the types of treatment? So that conjugated equine estrogen by itself didn't do much. So this line here, if you're on that side, you're protected. If you're on this side, you have an increased risk. So what you can see here, again, the treatment that worked best by itself was estradiol, the natural one, given up to 1 to 5 years, but then the effect starts to reverse. What did not work so well is estrogens and progesterogens together. But you can see here, for instance, that some of these progesterogens, so these are synthetic progesterogens, do not work so well. In fact, they really increase the risk when given over 5 years. But there might be a difference, like this progesterone, for instance, might not do that, but we need to do more research to see whether this synthetic progesterone can protect women, in fact, against the development of dementia. But these very commonly used progesterogens, when given together for over 5 years, do seem to increase the risk for dementia slightly. So here it's only by 10%, so it's not that much, but still. So in the earlier studies that we looked in, that Premarin, which was so commonly used by women, that synthetic estrogen, never really showed any positive effects. But the estradiol studies showed sort of very small effects. And sorry, that's not for 204 months, that's 2 to 4 months. They only showed very short-term real benefits, and then it kind of plateaued, and then people started reversing back to where they were before. Also, the type of progesterone, as I suggested, might make a difference, but there were 2 large studies that were done recently called KEEPS and ELITE, and they didn't really show massive differences. In fact, they didn't show any differences at all for estradiol or Premarin in maintaining brain function when women were given combination therapy. And that was done over a couple of years. So really, the judges out there, should you be taking hormones? Some small studies in women who were very symptomatic, who had lots of symptoms, who were not sleeping well, showed benefits. But overall, taking HRT, if you don't have symptoms, does not seem to make a difference in terms of developing dementia. Perhaps if you take it over longer periods of time, if you use combination therapy over 5, over 10 years, that will actually make you get worse. Some people say, well, is it because of the estradiol levels then? And some of these very early studies got really high levels of estrogens. And if we look here at that conjugated equine estrogen, that has lower estradiol levels than these transdermal patches. So transdermal patches of estradiol are probably better than the conjugated equine estrogen in terms of estradiol levels. But what we need to take into account here is that if you're older, and that Women's Health Initiative study, as I said, was done with older women, or if you already have dementia, having very high estradiol levels here, noted as E2, is not really very good for you. In fact, we found in Oxford that women who had Alzheimer's disease had higher levels of estradiol, and that was associated with having small hippocampi. We need the hippocampus for memory formation, and we see that that hippocampus goes down in Alzheimer's disease. So having high estradiol is not necessarily a good thing for older women, for women over 60. And that's what the observational data also showed, especially not in combination with progesterone. So to recap, if you undergo surgical menopause before the age of 50, that can accelerate memory decline. Estrogen by itself, especially estradiol, can reverse that. It might be because you now have less symptoms, like you sleep better, you have fewer flushes, fewer night sweats. So as a result, a couple of my colleagues came up with the window of opportunity theory. So they said, well, if you just give it close to the age of menopause, you'll be okay. But we've also found some very short-term benefits in our meta-analysis in women who had dementia. So the problem doesn't seem to be the initial benefits so much, but the problem is with longer term treatment, what happens? So if women are younger, we see an initial improvement, and that then kind of levels off to go back to baseline. So the edge is taken off the symptoms, and women are sleeping better, and the whole thing stabilizes, and women, are better able to function. And the same seems to happen to women with dementia. You see a brief boost, so the brain definitely benefits from it, according to some small studies, not in the larger studies so much. But these effects then start to go back to baseline, and in the older women, when the effect actually gets worse. So if you're over 60, especially when you're taking that combination treatment, the effects seem to be detrimental. So this is what we see. So normally in women who are not that old, we just see a reversal back to baseline. But after 10 and 16 years, women who had undergone surgical menopause, who were still using estradiol, actually weren't doing so well. They did way worse than the women who had stopped using HRT. So also for surgical menopause, probably don't take it after 5, certainly not after 10 years. Why is that? Well, what estradiol does is it maintains healthy nerve cells, healthy brain cells. It helps maintain that. It keeps the cell intact. But when the cell starts to break down and its energy factories no longer work, calcium channels don't work. Estrogens have a nasty habit of accelerating that decline. So they actually make a cell that's not doing so well way worse. And that is more likely to occur when you're older. One of the other pieces of bias is that women who tend to decide to use HRT before they do already are better educated, they have much better good cholesterol, they're more active, their blood pressure is lower, they have a lower weight, they're less at risk for diabetes. So they are already at much less risk for dementia. But that is not the case for women who undergo surgical menopause. They usually are slightly heavier, they have a worse profile of health, and they have less education. So this might explain some of the discrepancy that we see between women who undergo surgical menopause versus women who undergo natural menopause and then decide to take HRT as a lifestyle benefit. So while being active, while watching their weight, while eating well, they also take HRT. And that, of course, together protects them against dementia, because we know that when you eat well, you eat good fats, you eat beans and lentils and fibers, you'll be protected against dementia. You need to exercise. You need to exercise 30 minutes 5 times a week at least. Do some brisk walking, some swimming, increase your heart rate so your blood goes into your brain. You need to do muscle strength exercises to stop the wasting. Very important as you go through the menopause is your gum health can be affected, certainly when you smoke and drink alcohol. And so you can actually lose your teeth. So you want to make sure that your dental hygiene is way up there. Staying physically active, we know protects against dementia. The more people exercise, the more likely they are to stay without dementia. And these are studies we've done looking at strength exercises and how that very quickly can improve functioning on tests that are sensitive to dementia. In middle-aged women, in older women with and without dementia, these strength exercises are really good. And you can find them under the Loughborough website called Couch Potatoes for Cognition. Also walking and doing mixed stretch exercises with strength exercises, also in people with dementia, really helps improve their global cognitive function. So just some words about alternative treatments in terms of soy. We have a lot of questions about that. And as I said to you, one of the main issues at this point is that we see initial benefits in some groups are highly symptomatic, but also in some older people with dementia. So that biological effect might still be there, but that seems to reverse. And in fact, in the older women and over longer periods of time, might actually really become negative. So what can we do about it? Well, soy contains phytoestrogens. So they're plant-like estrogens, but they don't carry the risk for breast cancer, and they are presumed to have other health benefits. Now we have 2 types of soy that we looked at. One was tofu, which is soybean curd, and the other one is tempeh, and that's made by fermenting the whole soybean. And because of fermentation, we get folate and B12 produced. And folate and B12 are really important in protecting us against dementia. And folate we can find in green leafy veg, in oranges. B12 we can find in meat products, in yeast, in eggs, milk. And it's really important to help maintain your brain function and also your heart health for that matter. So basically, these phytoestrogens have very similar structures to estrogen, but probably when we look at these studies, only half the beneficial effect of estrogens on, for instance, hot flushes. And only half of the studies we reviewed showed benefits on memory function. So the majority of studies didn't really, at best, have. What we see is if we take soy supplements in the form of pills like Menopause or Menopause, we see that there are usually, like with estrogens, very short-term benefits for a couple of months, and then the effects go again. So when we looked at this in Indonesia, in the elderly, we found that tofu, very much like estrogens, increased dementia risk by 30%. Now, tempeh, on the other hand, the fermented soy product, decreased the risk by 20%, even in these older people. But these are Asian people, East Asian people, who are able to produce metabolites, which are highly estrogenic. So it probably doesn't translate so well to people in the West. So this is tempeh here being fermented. And when we gave tempeh to rats who had the ovaries removed, we saw that giving these rats tempeh could improve the memory of maize roots. So here we can see that. So here the ovaries are taken out. They have a dip, very much like that dip we saw in humans. And then we add back tempeh, which is very estrogenic, and we now see that their function is maintained. Tau or tofu does that, but to a lesser extent, like estradiol. And when they're not given anything, they don't show such an improvement. Now, what was really interesting was here that after the ovaries were taken out, plaques in the brain shot up. And that is really important because that means a lack of estrogens in these surgically menopausal animals could actually induce the dementia disease. Now, if these rats were then given tempeh, you can see that their performance, that the plaque load really decreases under the baseline. And for estradiol and tofu, it just went back to the baseline. But tempeh really pushed down the plaque formation, whereas the animals that were given casein, which is a control protein, no difference was seen. The plaque stayed quite high. It had an initial dip, but then bounced back to being at dangerous levels. So in Oxford, we already found, I showed you that the women with Alzheimer's disease had higher levels of estradiol. But if these women also had folate, high folate, they didn't perform under the baseline for dementia. So that was really good news. So maybe folate, for some reason or other, offsets negative effects, these negative effects of estrogens on all the brain cells by inducing further destruction if they're not doing so well. And in humans, we saw very similar effects. We saw in middle-aged Indonesian women that there were optimal levels of these phytoestrogens associated with better memory. Tempeh had in our treatment effects also benefits on memory in middle-aged women in the UK and in Indonesia, and also in older people, even with dementia. It could be that tempeh is so good because of folate and cobalamin, or maybe because of the fiber, reducing cholesterol. We don't know. There's lots of compounds, about 250 compounds that could be responsible for this, but we do know that folate is very good in reducing negative effects of high estrogens and in reducing dementia risk. So if we then, I'm not going to spend much time on this, but of course, we talked about the mood and the sexual issues, and these are far more complicated even than the effects on memory. Because yes, there is all sorts of biological plausibility, but in this time, we see all these different interactions going on. And mainly what we need to be aware of is that midlife is a tricky time, a very tricky time for self-image change and all sorts of pressures. You're aging, your children might have left home, or they hate you, or your partner's having a midlife crisis, your parents have become dependent, or they might have even died and you're grieving. Work-wise, you're not on top of it. But this is also a new beginning. So you could change your outlook. You could find new meaning, either in new goals, new hobbies. And remember that your friends are in the same boat. So you want to get support. You want to exchange what works. And there is a really amazing website called Stuff That Works, which is very good. So in conclusion, women who undergo premature, so before the age of 40, surgical menopause, should probably be treated with estrogens alone, up to the age of natural menopause, but probably not for longer than 5 to 10 years. Now, it's important because Emma showed you last week that there is a significant difference between having hormone treatment for less than 5 years, which has a much lower risk for breast cancer, versus over 5 years. This is particularly true for combined estrogen and progesterone treatment, and also the negative effects on brain function are much worse in the older women. So if we want to prevent dementia, we really need to think about a multidisciplinary lifestyle. So it's reducing triggers, better nutrition, regular exercise. So if we're talking about a natural menopause, yes, the brain has lots of receptors for hormones, for eating, emotion, sex, memory, and many women will complain as they're going through the transition, but that is not forever. If you are having mood issues, anxiety, usually it will, unless you've had that before, this will not start becoming a clinical issue unless there are other circumstances. You can take antidepressants, but they do have side effects. You will probably experience weight gain. You might lose your libido. And so is that any better at the end of the day? And they only work in about 50% of people. The memory issues we see are temporary, and they might be related to poor sleep, flushes, etc. So what can you do? Well, first do something about your lifestyle, reduce the triggers like spicy food, smoking, caffeine, alcohol, making sure you wear non-lycra type clothes, and reorient yourself. Your boss should support you, and do that in a discussion rather than try to sue somebody, because that's probably not so very not so very conducive. So ask for flex work, maybe taking less on or doing other things. You could try the phytoestrogens. As I said, for the majority of people, it works for a couple of months, if at all. But if you have severe symptoms, don't be afraid to ask for the hormones. They're probably quite safe, depending on your individual profile, up to 5 years. But after that, you might want to consider stopping taking them. So have a look at that website, Stuff That Works. It's really good because there's lots of women who will show similar problems to those you might be experiencing yourself. And I'm sorry, I hope we still have some time for questions. I've run a bit late. But I thank you very much for your attention, and I'll take some questions now if you have any.
Thank you very much, Eef. That was very interesting, and I think we certainly have got a lot of questions coming in on the chat already. If anyone would like to ask their question directly to Eef, if you could raise your hand, I will come to those people first. But just to pick a couple out of the chat, any that we don't get to, we'll answer at a later date, and we will collate all of those and share them with you. We're getting some questions around, is there a point at which it's too late to start HRT?
Yeah, I definitely say if you're 10, 15 years past menopause, it's probably not a good idea to do so. There is the information that we've seen suggests that there is actually an increased risk in women. Bryony Parker put in, by the way, that the information was outdated. Bryony, do you want to tell me what you think is outdated?
I don't. We've had a few questions around whether there have been changes over the last kind of 20 years in HRT treatments available.
Oh, absolutely. So I hope that I've showed you that initially there was great enthusiasm in the 80s for HRT treatment. And then after the Women's Health Initiative studies came out, it was very negative. Yeah, you can unmute, Bryony. I'm happy to have a talk with you because I'd like to see where the comment came from. I'll finish what I've said and then, come in. What then happened with the Women's Health Initiative study is that people said, okay, this increases dementia, don't take it. And what we're seeing from the observational studies is that might well be the case if women take combination therapy for over 10 years, in their 60s, when they're 65, but that it's perfectly safe probably to do so, certainly with an estradiol, certainly if you've undergone surgical menopause and you're only taking estradiol for about up to 5 years. So, Bryony, tell me.
I don't know if Bryony can unmute, actually.
Oh.
I think she's having some
problems
with the sound.
Unmuting.
Yeah.
Vicky, then. Can Vicky unmute herself?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Yeah.
I actually posted a question about a lot of what you've shown today is the research base is more than 20 years old, and a lot of the things that I've been listening to on different podcasts with different doctors that have been doing this subject have said different things around the fact that the types of treatments have moved on, and there's lots of different information out there that would suggest that don't just go if your symptoms are really severe, and I mean it's what you would class as really severe, it's the impact in your life, then you basically try anything. But it just feels like, I don't know whether there's more studies that have been done that would counteract some of what's been said.
Yeah, I mean, loads of studies have been done, large studies have been done, and they don't actually show benefits. So whereas the individual woman over longer periods of time, so we see short benefits over a couple of months in some small studies. Definitely if women have very bad symptoms, but the treatment studies, KEEPS, ELITE that have come out, do not show an overall benefit on cognitive function. Now, the question is, why is that the case? Because these studies included women who had symptoms, but also women who did not have symptoms. So I think, I don't know that Dr. Newson has done, similar large trials as have been done in the US. And when we look at the Cochrane meta-analyses that have been done in this area, there is no overall benefit of HRT on memory function. I've looked at this area for 30 years and I've regularly looked at it and I can't see it. I wish it was there, but it's not. Whereas I think smaller studies have found it, definitely. And I think a lot of women report the benefit. If we see that these issues are measurable in 1 in 4 women, that still means that 3 in 4 women, we cannot see the issues that women report. Now, either we're not doing the right tests or the effects are due to something else. We don't know that, but they're not measurable in 3 out of 4 women. They're temporary. This will not set you up to develop dementia. I think it's really important to know that. And taking HRT over longer periods of time, to the best of my knowledge, does not, improve memory function over longer periods of time. I think what we don't know at this stage is, and that's quite problematic, because I think we have a systematic bias in that women who tend to take HRT are already doing their best to stay very healthy. So it might well be that the combination of staying healthy and eating well, sleeping, exercising, and HRT has a cumulative effect. So there's some data to suggest that. But the treatment studies, as far as I know, have not, improved that. And, for the individual woman, definitely, I'm certainly with Dr. Louise Newson. If you have symptoms and you are losing the plot and you have brain fog and you've tried everything else and it doesn't work, try hormones, try them. And I mean, certainly I tried them, I used them, but just not perhaps for more than 5 years, which is when your risk for breast cancer starts going up if you're using combination therapy. And we don't see any more benefits after, say, 10 years in these large trials. So, yeah, but it's a very controversial topic. There's lots of advocates for it. A lot of these people are also paid by pharmaceutical industry. Not saying Louise's or any of these people necessarily. A lot of people are. I'm not, because I've always been very independent in that I don't actually want to take money from pharmaceutical industry to go one way or the other. I look at the data. So I do meta-analysis. I don't look at one study, I look at many studies, and I can't see an overall benefit for taking hormones for longer than 10 years. I think it then starts to become risky. Does that make sense?
Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes. Hi, Bryony. Yes, we can hear you and we can see you as well.
Thank you. A lot of the information has been very interesting, but from my perspective, I follow Dr. Louise Newson, have done for a while, and I've had a consultation. I listen to the podcast, not just to other people as well. And it's my understanding, what I've learned, that I'm on the body identical estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone, all of them, and I feel so much better for it. My understanding is that firstly, it's never too late to start taking HRT, and really, once you enter into the menopause, there is no coming out the other side. It is what it is. You can never replace those hormones. Once they're gone, they're gone, and that you're on HRT till the day that you die. Dr. Louise's eldest patient is 95, started taking it at 95. And has felt so much better since she's done it. So it's conflicting.
That's very conflicting, isn't it? Because that's not what the data show.
Right. Well, that's what I've learned and have. So what you're saying is quite the opposite. So I'm quite confused now, because obviously.
I imagine you are. Yeah. If I can just come in there, Bryony. So it's not just what I say. I think it's what the data say. Yeah, so if we're looking at, I mean, I appreciate you feel good. I feel good on hormones. In fact, I'd advise it to anybody. If you're suffering, take it. I don't necessarily agree with you, take it at any age. I don't think the data substantiate that. It depends very much on your state of health. There are plenty of contraindications. For instance, if you have a risk for blood clotting, you might not want to take it. But again, some people say, yeah, you can do it as long as you monitor, as long as you take transdermal. It's fine. But I think there is enough data out there to suggest that there's been a large Finnish study as well, showing that if you take it for longer than 10 years, you start becoming at risk for dementia. So I'm not talking about any of the other health issues, but you start becoming at risk for dementia, certainly with combination therapy. And it's controversial. There are people saying, no, take it for longer, take it for 30 years, taking it for your entire life. What we can see, though, is that at the other side of it, so without taking hormones, is that for the majority of women, this dip in functioning reverses back to normal. Because if we compare, for the longest time, we were just comparing women before menopause and after menopause, and we didn't really see a massive difference. It's in that transition phase where the body is is adapting that we see that change. And yeah, I appreciate it. It's a highly controversial topic, but I'm working with the data. I don't, I have no vested interest. I'm not selling drugs.
No,
I'm just looking at what's there. Yeah. But if you feel great, that's good.
Well, I do feel great, but I mean, I'm obviously concerned that, because as far as I was aware, I'm on this forever. Yeah. This is me forever. And I was under the impression that the risk of dementia is dramatically decreased if you are actually keeping your hormone levels where they should be from when you were,
I think it very much depends on your health status. So if you are healthy,
well, I'm vegan. I've been for a long time. I eat lots of tempeh.
Exactly.
So, I have a very healthy diet, and I exercise regularly, and I'm quite fit and healthy in that respect. I've never had high blood pressure. I've put on I have put on weight with lockdown and whatever, and probably that's a bit of menopause things as well, whatever. But generally, I'm very healthy, and I look after myself in that respect. So I'm sort of quite surprised to learn that opposites to what I've already thought to be pretty sound advice.
Well, I'm not negating. I mean, I'm with Dr. Louise Newson, don't get me wrong, and I'm not saying she's being paid. I'm not accusing her of being paid by the pharmaceutical industry at all.
I'm aware of that. Doesn't.
No. This is not. It is how you interpret the data, and I think where we stand now is I've seen enough, and believe you me, I've started looking at this in 1987, and I've been bowled over by the effect. I've tested women who were treated, and the effect was so dramatic. These were women who were crying their eyes out, who couldn't remember a thing, took estradiol, and just, the effect was amazing. So I've always been stunned by the benefits you could see. However, the question is about the long-term effects, and there is enough data to suggest that I don't think women should take it for longer than 10 years. Sorry?
How recent is that data?
That data came out this year. That data
in your report today, or did I miss that?
Here, let me see. Let me show you. So this data that I showed you about the increased risk, that is a huge study, 2021. In the BMJ, it's huge. And here you can see that increased risk in combination therapy. That was the only really significant effect, was a slight increased risk.
What's the report called? You don't mind?
It's in the BMJ. The main author is Vonogradova. Have a look at it.
How do you spell that?
What that study, as it is here on the slide.
Is it
you can't see your slide, Eef?
Oh, you can't see my slide anymore?
No.
Okay, I'm so sorry for everybody else who might have had questions. If you don't mind, can you see it?
Yeah.
If you don't mind, please put them in the chat, and Emma and I will answer them. So here, what that report says is there is no overall effect, okay, of taking HRT. But the only slight effect here that is significant is in the sub-analysis where women undergoing natural menopause who take it for more than 10 years have an increased risk of dementia. A very small effect, very, very tiny, but the effect is there. And that is the same as a study that came out from Finland in a couple of years ago, huge study as well, in women who took it for longer than 10 years, when they were younger than 60, or at any age over 60, for any duration over 60, their risk was increased. But it's a highly controversial area. So you will find, people who will say, no, there is no effect, or there is a negative effect, or there is a benefit. That's
Thank you, Eef, for clarifying on that one. I think we do need to bring this to a close now, so we have run over a little bit. Thank you very much for this afternoon's talk, Eef, and thank you to everybody that has given us questions. As I said, we've got loads of questions in the chat and we won't get a chance to answer all of them. So I will draw this to a close now, but I will leave the call running for the next 5 or 10 minutes. So if people have still got questions, please do put them into the chat, and Eef will follow up on these at a later date, and I will circulate an email to everybody when the answers to these are available. So once again, thank you very much, Eef, and thank you everyone else for coming. We have got another talk this time next week from Professor Rebecca Hardy, who will be looking at menopause across the life course. So hopefully you can join us then. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, and do be in touch. You know, it's a controversial area. Thank you, Bryony, for sticking, you know,
Thank you. It's been very informative. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye. Take care. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.